It's a real delight to welcome you all here this evening for what is the second Provocation in our series. This will be on feasting and drinking, organised by UCL's Centre for Research on the Dynamics of Civilisation. I'm Maria Wyke, one of the directors of the new centre. Mike Rowlands over here will be our chair for this evening. The centre is seeking to enhance the current scrutiny of the concept and the social phenomenon of civilization. We want to help provoke debate and stimulate collaborative research within UCL, across its departments and beyond UCL. Research that cuts across disciplines, periods or places of expertise. So in the next few months, and this is directed at colleagues within UCL, I should say, this little bit, within the next few months the Centre will be advertising calls for proposals for research grants to support conferences, workshops, other civilizational events at UCL. In June, we will be holding our next provocation, which will be on language. And we are planning for the next academic year other provocations or discussions like this on sustainability versus collapse, on possibly theories of civilization. And we would very much welcome from any of you suggestions for other such topics for the course of the next few academic years. We're also continuing to plan large-scale lectures on regions. We had a very fruitful and stimulating lecture on China earlier this term. In November, Wendy Doniger will be coming here from the University of Chicago to talk about, at least I hope she is, to talk about Hinduism, civilization and religion. And other lectures will follow on, for example, we hope, the Middle East, on Africa and the Mediterranean. We're also planning a workshop in the autumn on civilization and subjectivity, the way civilization is nurtured or challenged within the person, and an international conference in spring 2015 on civilization and materiality, and how European civilization has been constructed through material encounters with the non-European. So we would welcome suggestions from any of you on further civilizational events, because the purpose of the centre is to support and take forward the research that members of UCL and their colleagues want to undertake. And for today, we also hope that you will be able to join us afterwards, particularly given our topic, in a little bit of drinking, not too much feasting, I'm afraid, which we hope will take place in the common room next door. And I say hope because there was another event in there earlier, which means our drinks were not yet in the place in case they were confused. So now I'm panicking. Now I'm panicking about whether they're going to turn up at all. But hopefully, after our talks this evening and after our discussion, there'll be opportunity to have some refreshment in the room next door. Okay, so over to you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Maria, thank you very much. The topic of civilization obviously is one which is meant to be provocative in itself, but I think we tend to look at it in terms of different aspects and different ways in which we can make it provocative. And I think the idea of being civilized or uncivilized is one of those which immediately has a certain sense of the the derogatory to it, as well as the idea of some kind of idea of perfections. And it has many issues around moral and ethical views of the person. And because, and particularly our theme of feasting and drinking involves ingestion, taking things in, we have quite a corporeality, a notion of the person which links very much to ideas about the body and personhood. So I think we have a very fascinating, sort of topic besides a very promiscuous one, as Sami Zubaida, one of our first speaker, will be once said, food is very promiscuous. We say what are we going to eat, as much as where. We all are supposed to be able to eat just about everything and anything. And yet when it comes to movement and mobility and migration, we're also incredibly conservative. You only have to think about what people would insist on taking with them somewhere, what they must have to eat where they are, and they won't give up. And there's also the whole ambivalence of that around, what is good food, what is health, and what is illness, food and poisoning, etc. So there are many themes here which I've come down to what we mean by this word of feasting and drinking. And I think the emphasis may be also towards drinking as much as feasting. Anyway, we have 4 speakers to discuss this with us this evening from very different backgrounds. Sami Zubaida is Emeritus Professor of Politics and Sociology at Birkbeck College in London. He wrote a wonderful article about growing up in the Baghdad kitchen in Iraq. And he's written many other things, particularly on the sociology and politics of food. But that's one that I think I remember with great pleasure. Our first speaker, then Christopher Carey, who has written very much on many things. He's a professor of Greek here at UCL, worked and written very much on poetics and poetry and lyrics, but also on the symposium. And I think he will be able to get us to talk about the difference between different kinds of sequences or forms of feasting and drinking. And then Cowrie O'Connor is a senior research fellow in anthropology, in the anthropology department at UCL. And her most recent book, in fact, he just published, is on feasting and comparison of feasting, isn't it?
Yeah. Just about out. Yeah.
Just about out, by Bloomsbury Press. Yeah. So, and I mean, Cowrie is as an anthropologist who really does compare. She's a real comparative anthropologist. So that will be a great pleasure. And then finally, Dorian Fuller, who is Professor of Archaeobotany here. But I've had great pleasure working with him on various times, because he really does embed archaeobotany in culture and in the long-term ideas of history. He's a kind of archaeologist, as an anthropologist, one can actually talk to and work with great pleasure. So we will end with Dorian and the longue durée. But can I start with inviting Sami to give us his presentation?
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be invited to participate in what will be an exciting occasion. And I'm going to talk about drink in relation to food in a comparative way, but with an emphasis on the Middle East, which is where my work is mostly on the Middle East. And seeing it's a provocation, I'm going to make some bold generalizations, so bear with me. The place of alcohol in different cultures can be broadly divided into dietary and recreational, which these functions overlap over time. Wine in some southern European countries, notably Italy and parts of France, had been, until sort of early modernity, integral to the diet and the source of calories and of uncontaminated drink. Before the spread and democratization of coffee and tea and the cheapening of sugar. And this, of course, was also true in Northern Europe, including in this country, where people who could afford it had for breakfast small beer, which was a way of avoiding drinking contaminated water. Now, beer, locally made with millet and maize, has a similar dietary function in parts of Africa. In parts of the Sudan, pious Muslims drink it without associating it with forbidden alcohol. It is liquid bread. While in most of the modern world, the uses of alcohol are recreational, associated with leisure and pleasure. It remains for many an important element of the balance of diet and of the meal, functions which I shall explore presently. Now, I'm going to come to my generalization. As part of the meal, drink is in some contexts part of the meal, as in Southern Europe and in the upper classes and more leisured classes in Northern Europe, or outside the meal, as typically in many contexts in more common British practice, let's say in the 20th century, in which people who drink would have a pint or two after work, then have a meal and maybe go out to the pub afterwards, and maybe have fish and chips after the pub, or curry more normally. So then drink is not part of the structure of the meal in this instance, and as I think we'll hear, and I hesitate to anticipate, the kind of, you can also contrast the Greek and the Roman models, the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman models, in that, as I understand it, the symposium was drink after or apart from the meal, whereas the Roman banquet was the combination of the two. Now, with that in mind, we come to the idea of slow food. You're probably all familiar with the slow food movement, which started in Italy in the 1980s and had caught on in a big way all over the world, and many sort of chapters and convivia had been organized all over in many parts of the world. And the idea of slow food is first of all, it was a protest against fast food and the industrialization and processing of food, and an attempt to revive, as they saw it, ways of not only eating slowly, but eating with pleasure, and the emphasis was on pleasure, and that the food that is eaten is produced seasonally, locally, with skill and craft, and the whole idea was to revive or protect artisanal producers, and of course often what revive meant was to reinvent. Now, of course, who can disagree with that? I'm wholly in favor of the objectives of slow food, but at the same time the slow food movements tended to mythologize the history of food and eating, in the sense that the sort of modern fast food and industrial food was contrasted to what was supposed to be historical patterns of eating, which was slow and which happened in company, over the table, with wine, with drink, and with emphasis on pleasure, on conviviality. Now, of course, this is a complete myth for most of the world, most of human history. Most people ate fast, and many people, of course, on many occasions, did not eat meals. They just ate while they were working or going to work, or grabbed some food here and there, in much the same way, but in very different contexts to what happens now. So, in fact, what the model for the slow food movement was a particular kind of European, and maybe some other, maybe Japanese, I don't know, elite eating, in which people would sit around the table and would have different dishes, eat slowly, and drink wine with that. Or, indeed, for peasant societies, the feasting, which would happen on a number of occasions a year, would be of that kind, but that would not be normal everyday food. Now, I'd like to make a general proposition, which is that the combination of food and drink, that drink interwoven with food, has a civilizing function for both activities, slowing down food consumption and moderating intoxication. In short, fulfilling the ideal posited by slow food. Now I'll look at some examples drawn mostly from the Middle East. First of all, there's an interesting work on the history of the exchange of ambassadors between the Ottomans and the French. And one such was about the meal. The history of the exchange of ambassadors in the 18th century provides an illustration of contrasts in modes of formal eating. The French ambassador reported that after the formalities of presentation at court, he was invited to take a meal with the courtiers, not with the Sultan. The Sultan always ate alone, and that has implications for the development of food culture. He was led to a hall with a number of small tables and a high table at one end, and he was sat at the high table with other dignitaries. A succession of sumptuous dishes are then served at a fair pace. Everyone ate in silence, and the whole affair was finished within the hour. The story from the Ottoman ambassador in France, one Yermi Seki's Mehmed Effendi, was quite different. He took to French courtly and aristocratic life with curiosity and pleasure. He marveled at the leisurely dinners, well irrigated with wine and animated by conversation, wit and flirtation. It was the presence and the leading role of women on these occasions which most intrigued Mehmed Effendi. Was this because the Ottomans did not drink as Muslims? That's not the case. They drank a great deal. One of the 17th century Sultan Murad IV, who was very stern in forbidding his subjects to drink or to have coffee or tobacco, was at the same time himself a noted drinker and was known as Murad the Sot. And he died young, apparently, from liver illness. But so drinking was common at all levels of society, and I've written on that. I haven't got time to go into it. But again, it was quite likely that for the most part, food and drink were separated. So we have, in Middle Eastern court cultures, from Abbasid times on, we have accounts of meals and of drinking sessions and of books of etiquette, the etiquette of drinking parties and so on. And we also have poetry. So there is a whole genre of poetry in Arabic called khamriyat, which it means wine poems, which celebrate wine and talk about it. It's being forbidden and, the pleasure of being sinful and so on. But there's also a whole genre of poems addressed to the table and to food and to the beauty of food and the succession of dishes at the caliph's table. But the two somehow are quite separate. There is hardly any mention of wine in the food poems and vice versa. Now, this separate, and of course we also have patterns in the stories in the Arabian Nights, which again, the table of viands is finished and taken away, and the table of wine is brought in. Now, what happened, however, in more recent times in the Middle East is the development of a pattern of eating which is now becoming familiar everywhere, which is the idea of mezze. Mezze, of course, now is, all the high streets you'll see mezze and kebab bars or whatever. But of course, had only a recent introduction here. And in the Middle East, you have mention of it mostly from the 19th century in the mostly in Mediterranean cities of Turkey and the Arab Levant, and mostly cities which had Christian populations. So Istanbul, Izmir, Beirut, Damascus, and so on. Now, what the mezze, of course, people just having a little something with a drink is nothing new. People have always done that. But with why the mezze is new was that it became a kind of explicit genre of eating, codified particular dishes and particular etiquettes of what goes with what and what comes first and later, and you have the whole pattern which differs from city to city of nuts, beans, pickles, salads, dips, fish, meat patties and dumplings, savory stuffed pastries, burek, and much else. Drink also became a social marker between the different classes and outlooks. So in fact, in Istanbul in particular, whereas historically drink had been hidden for the upper classes, but taverns were for the lower classes, in the 19th century you have secularization of public life and the rise of the tavern for the middle classes, for the new state class of civil servants, professionals, educated people who prided themselves on being civilized, medeniyet, which actually means civilization. And part of being modern and civilized was that you drank. Of course, I should add, it was only the men who did this. And so there was a whole type of new kind of cafe, bar, which catered for them and prided itself on its mezze and its water pipe, the nargile, and on the etiquette of drinking, of savoir boire, as someone called it. And drink then became a social marker between this class and the traditional classes, who were also middle classes or upper classes, but who were religious and who differentiated themselves. And it's interesting that until recently and until the present time, the restaurants in Istanbul are divided between fish restaurants, which are called meyhane, which means tavern, and meat restaurants. This is ending now, but still there are distinct traces of it. And the fish restaurants had alcohol, the meat restaurants for the most part did not, and did not serve fish. And this is something that interests me greatly, is the attitude to fish and the relation of fish to alcohol in Turkey and the Arab Levant, which there seemed to be a reservation traditionally about fish, and particularly about shellfish and seafood, which doesn't exist among the Muslim population, let's say in the Persian Gulf. Now, so how am I doing for time?
2 or 3 more minutes.
Yeah. So let me just say then that the mezze was not the dinner. It is not an hors d'oeuvre, what some people translate it as, because it's specifically meant to be with drink. It's not part of the meal. So the idea was that after an evening of drinking, eating mezze, you would then have a supper, either at home or out. And what's happening increasingly is that the mezze is replacing the dinner, and it's becoming a pattern of eating which conforms to the slow food model of being slow, convivial, pleasure with drink. And what's more, I think with the globalization of these patterns of eating, now we have a whole genre of this sort of food in restaurants and also in homes, which is replacing the 3-course meal idea. So in fact now the sort of fashionable thing in London and many cities is for people to eat mezze or tapas or cicchetti or a tasting menu in the fine dining restaurants, and all with drink. That's on the one side. On the other side you have the TV dinner, in which of course people often do drink, but that then is solitary and probably rapid. Thanks.
Okay, well, again, I'd like to echo Sammy's thanks to the organisers for the invitation, and thank you all for turning up. Much of what I have to say intersects very nicely with what Sammy has to say, with reference to, among other things, drink and leisure, drink and recreation, and also questions of identity and social structure. I'm not interested, obviously, particularly in eating and drinking. The Greeks always ate and drank. Everywhere you went in the Greek world, there were pubs and bars in ports and towns. And of course, people could always eat at home. We tend to forget just how much eating is and drinking is unstructured. What I'm interested in is more simply formal drinking. It's the formal drinking party, the symposium, which interests me today. And there you have it, or at least there you have the start of it. Now, you don't normally in classical in ancient Greece, you don't normally drink with your meal. You normally eat and then you start the drinking after the meal, and it tends to be a very formal process. There is, for instance, normally a very formal layout to the room. The guests tend to recline. They don't normally sit up. As you can see, they tend to recline on long couches, and they tend to be situated around the wine bowl. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that the Greeks do not normally drink neat wine. They normally mix their wine, and the centerpiece of a symposium is normally the mixing bowl, in which you mix wine and water in various quantities. There were rumours that drinking unmixed wine could actually seriously damage your health and even destroy your mind. The Spartan king Cleomenes was believed by many to have lost his mind precisely because he was in the habit of drinking his wine unmixed. So you're situated around the drinking bowl, and the discussion of the quantities in the mix forms an important part of many of our texts. It's often in a men's room, and I'll come back to that gender issue in a moment. It's often in a men's room set aside for this purpose, and normally a room that will take a maximum of about 16 couches. I used the word formal before. One can go further, I think, and use the language of ritual. It's a highly ritualized process. It starts and ends with a ritual. You normally, for instance, take your first drink and pour it on the ground as a drink offering to the gods, as a libation, and you normally end again with a libation. And the process itself is often highly ritualized. The games tend to be very structured, and as time goes on, in fact, you tend to get increasing elaboration in the process of drinking. Now, of course, anyone can have a drinking party. You don't have to be rich to drink. And we do get occasional texts which point to drinking parties low down the social scale. The text I've given you there is from Aristophanes' Peace, and it's a group of peasant farmers, and they're celebrating the arrival of peace. And of course, peace in Greek comedy tends to mean a limited number of things. In fact, usually it means food, drink and sex, and usually in large quantities of all of them. This one focuses principally on drink, and you can see there that what they're anticipating is a moment of leisure, when it's raining, when you can't get any work done as a farmer. And so what they do is they set up a drinking party. However, if you scroll back, you can see that what this is for this group is a brief interlude in a life of labour. This is not a habitual practice. And the symposium is therefore especially associated in Greek culture with the elite, with people who have the time and leisure to drink socially regularly. So there is an element of social exclusivity about the symposium. It becomes therefore a very important status and group marker. And I'll talk firstly about status, but I'll return to groups later on. Also exclusive in terms of gender. Where am I? Let's see. Yep. Sorry, there's a piece missing. I do apologise. There's a text missing, and that is the text should tell you, and it doesn't, that women are not guests at the symposium. This is very much a male activity. Females are not welcome guests, and it can be held against a woman that she eats and drinks at formal parties in the presence of large numbers of men. Decent women are not welcome at drinking parties. Indecent women, however, are very welcome, and they come in various kinds. Obviously, you need someone to entertain you with music, and there you can see a flute player moving among the men as they drink. Watch the man next to the end on the left. Watch what he's doing with his wrist, because we'll come back to that wrist movement later on. And of course, so you've got music, and then you've got ladies who are better at more closer contact sports, courtesans. So people who are available to entertain, and of course the difference between a musician and a sex worker can be a very easily blurred boundary. So what you've got is singers, dancers, courtesans who are there to entertain you. The institution goes back at least to the Archaic period, and that is a 6th century relief from the temple of Athene at Assos, which is on the northwest coast of what is now Turkey. You can take it back to the Archaic period, so right the way to the period between 700 and 500 BC, and presumably further back again. It's a very, very long established custom, and it exists throughout Greek history. Now, I mentioned exclusion. Inclusion is as important as exclusion. The symposium both keeps people out and defines those who are in. The symposium is where one makes one's social connections, and it's where one learns to behave in company. It's a regular theme in Greek poetry of the Archaic period that one needs to learn as a young man how to behave in company, and the symposium is a good testing ground of that, and it's also a good testing ground of one's ability to control oneself and one's ability to deal ably with other people and to recognise good and bad character from people's social behaviour. It's also very closely linked with homosexuality from the very earliest period. This is from Paestum, this wall relief, and again watch the man on the far left. Watch that wrist movement, because I'll come back to the wrist movement in a moment. It matters a lot. But as you can see, the two men on the right are getting friendly, and there is a strong link between structured Greek homosexuality and structured Greek drinking. Just to remind you, I'm sure you all know, that homoeroticism in ancient Greece in its classic form is normally an uneven relationship. It's a relationship between an older man and a young male, and there is usually a strong element of pursuit and flight, with very firmly defined roles for the two parts in the relationship. Now, it's not merely about physical gratification, it also ties in with concepts of education. And an important part of Greek homoeroticism for the younger man is learning how to behave in society, developing life models from an older lover, advice from the older lover, and of course very important for networking as well. So, not just drink, of course, music is important. There is a strong emphasis on music as part of the entertainment in the symposium, but not just professional entertainers. There is a lot of emphasis on amateur drinking in the Greek symposium. Music is an important part of the education of every Greek man of any sort of substance, and there is a tendency in symposia for the singing to move around the group. Often, again, highly ritualized. You will pass a branch around as the duty to sing moves from one member of the group to another. But a lot of amateur singing, often presumably of a relatively high quality. Also games, and this is where the wrist flick matters. One of the games that the Greeks loved was kotobos, and it's a game that you play by flicking the wine lees. It's the bit in the bottom of your cup that won't come out when you tilt it, however much you may. And they play various games. Kotobos takes a number of forms. This is the falling kotobos, and this one you actually aim at a target, and the aim is to make the target ring with the wine as it spatters. Sometimes you have a little statue on the top, and the statue is knocked off by the wine lees and clatters into a bowl at the bottom. So playing games with wine, an important part of the process as well. Riddles, lots of word games are part of it as well. Now, I mentioned song, and Sammy mentioned singing at parties. Drinking songs were produced in early Greece in industrial quantities. There was an inexhaustible market for drinking songs, and they travelled around the whole of the Greek world. The best drinking songs literally lasted for centuries, and they migrated around the Greek world. So there's an enormous demand for drinking songs. Inevitably songs about love, both heterosexual and homosexual. This is a poem by one of the great archaic masters, Anacreon, and you can see there that it's a love song to a boy at the party. So, place for drinking and love and hate. One of the best haters. The ancient Greeks in general were good haters, and Archilochus was one of the best of the archaic Greek haters, and this is part of an ongoing feud with an enemy like Cambys. So hate also is enormously important. And politics, lots and lots of political singing, plus of course, for those who don't sing, political discussion, political manoeuvring takes place at the symposium. So lots and lots of politics. That's Alcaeus in Lesbos, actively engaged in ongoing civil war in Lesbos, and the symposium is obviously one of the places where they plot their action. So what that gives us then is another kind of exclusiveness. I mentioned identity, and in fact what I was talking about initially was vertical exclusiveness, that is the difference between high and low. There's also horizontal exclusiveness, because different factions have their own different drinking parties, in which obviously, among other things, they will manoeuvre against each other. So drinking parties are very important for definition on at least two axes and maybe more. Now, what I describe sounds idyllic, if a little socially exclusive, highly structured, decorous. And the Greeks do tend to idealize the symposion. It plays a very important part in Greek thinking about life. This is a passage from Homer's Odyssey, and Athene arrives and finds riotous feasting in Ithaca. And the Odyssey, like many Greek poems, makes much of the idea of the symposium as a model. Not merely a model for the individual, but it can become a model for civilization. It's about structure, about ritual, about relationships, and therefore you can model ways of living your life on the symposium. And the Greeks, as I say, do tend to idealize the symposium. It becomes a way of thinking about the world. It's good to think with as well as good to drink with. So it plays a very important role. It's a model for order. But if you look at this text there, the symposium is also a model for disorder. And there is always this potential for things to slide. A text such as this one, this is Xenophanes writing at the end of the 6th century BC. You can see there that what he does is he presents the model of an ideal ordered drinking party. But of course, if you flip that, what it's also revealing is anxieties about the way in which drinking can in fact degenerate very readily into something sinister and dangerous. And there is always the potential for violence. And this isn't merely an abstract. We do know that people were in the habit of drinking at symposia and then wandering the streets looking for other symposia that they could then invade. And Plato's dialogue, the symposium, one of the high moments of it is when the politician Alcibiades bursts into the party to gatecrash with drinking with flute girls and courtesans and drunk friends. And of course, these people are also a danger to passers-by, because if you encounter them, you may come away bruised. So there is always, I think, the potential for violence, and more than that, of course, there is the potential for social unrest, because the symposium ties in to faction, and with faction, of course, you end up with the potential for plotting. And so I think what one has in the symposium is something highly structured, certainly, highly ritualized, highly organized, and something which in Greek thinking is capable both of expressing the extreme of order, but of course is also capable of expressing the extreme of disorder. Thank you.
I'm sorry Chris is gone, because in many ways what I'm going to say is a very nice parallel. But anyway, this is the topic, and here is the starting quote, which I love. You can all read it. Civilization stands or falls by the degree to which drink has entered the lives of its people. And very high among the Japanese, although that's not necessarily the first thing we think of. This is what we think of. That's right. January, UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage granted to traditional Japanese food. This actually isn't all that traditional, because there's quite a lot of Western element. This isn't what you would have had, say, 200 or 300 years ago, but we'll call this traditional. Okay, now why has it been given this? In the words of UNESCO, or UNESCO speak, it's this food is transmits from generation to generation identity. It strengthens social cohesion, and many of its elements are symbolic. All right, so now this is at length something that Mary Douglas, the late and great, said in 4 words, which is food is not feed. It's not. It's a lot more. It's everything more. It's symbolism, it's history, it's memory, and above all, it isn't just cohesion, though, as UNESCO said, because feasts are as much about the opposite, disorder, disassociation, and exclusion, as we will see. Right, now, the one thing missing from this picture is alcoholic drink, and if you look at it, you would think that if this is a feast, and this is in fact the modern example of a formal meal, the sort that you would have, say, at a family banquet to mark an important occasion. So this is the formal thing, but you see no drink here, and it would be possible to think that there was no drink. But there was. One thing there was not in early time was tea, which we think of as being, in Japan from time immemorial. It didn't appear until the 13th century. So I'm saying that drink is absolutely central to the whole dynamic of feasting in Japan, but it is very much glossed over in the official representation today as it was in the past. Now, here we are. I love this. My two ladies on the right. This is the conventional portrayal of drinking in Japan, which is non-alcoholic. It's tea. You have this geisha, absolutely controlled in every way, nothing out of place, presenting the tea, following a etiquette that's well established. And on the right, you have another geisha, clothing in hair adrift, and what she's doing is she's drinking sake, straight from the sake ewer. Now, this was just as much a part of what was going on as the tea, but as I say, it's very sub rosa. But you have to take my word for it. It's there. So now we're going to look at it, because the anthropological view would be that both order and disorder, control and chaos, are essential to the social dynamic. We call it complementary opposition, and it is exemplified both in what Chris was talking about and in the feasting and drinking cycle in Heian, Japan. And why am I going back to Heian, Japan? This is, I gave you the dates, but the important thing about it is it's Japan after contact with China has been severed in 894 and before the time of the samurai, which is the militaristic. So you have this window. But we're going back there because this is the first time that you have reliable written Japanese accounts. So whatever you see is there at that time, and then we can only go on from there because we're not really sure about what happened before. Now, okay, 894, Japan cut off diplomatic contact with China, and during the following 5 centuries, it embarks on this program of Japanness, and what it left behind, Dorian's going to talk about, but it's reinventing itself, and some people would say that what they took from China before contact was cut off was absolutely fundamental. The Japanese view is that they just took a few things that they liked, but really everything that they are and was purely Japanese. Okay, now, in the Japanese period, Heian is regarded as the golden age because you have this wonderful literature. The most famous is The Tale of Genji by Lady Murasaki, and it's an indigenous, tradition written in Japanese, and what it portrays is this really strange, dreamlike world. It's a world of court society. It's a palace within the capital city. All the action takes place there. Food, drink, beautiful clothes appear as if by unseen hand. The common people are never seen. Tribute comes from the hinterland. You don't know how, and it turns up. And the society is very, very rich, but it is not as calm as it may look. Now, why not? Okay. This is the kind of thing, as you see, the appearance is really different to the samurai era. This you have these men in voluminous, almost Chinese-style gowns, tall hats. These are the women in the flowing robes, 7 or 8 layers minimum, all of them showing long robes and hair down your back. That's the great beauty feature. And they drift around in these buildings that have wide verandas, traditional Japanese design then as now, no set rooms. You just have sliding screens. You can make huge dramatic spaces inside and outside. And what happens here is, although it looks very, very calm and there is no military conflict going on, which is why culture flourished, you have this seething under the surface. The first thing is religion. From China, you had Taoist belief, Confucian values, legalism, Chinese bureaucratic organization. Then you have different sects of Buddhism, which had come in and were competing. And then you have indigenous Chinese religion, which, I mean, you would be more familiar with today as Shinto. And these are all competing at a very early stage, so nobody has established priority. And then the second source is political. The original Japanese structure was the emperor at the top and everyone below. But in the Heian period, one clan, the Fujiwara, gained control, and they used the emperor as a symbolic puppet while they actually ran the country, and they married their daughters to the emperor, and so they controlled in two ways. And the main thing is the Fujiwara had to fight off challenges from other clans and then challenges within their clan. And finally, you had Japanese social structure. There were, there were 9 different ranks of people at court, and each of these ranks were subdivided. There were 4 different ranks for the imperial family. So all of this is tremendously unstable. You could just see how it would be fermenting, and to control it, what they had is the most stringent kind of etiquette I think ever seen on earth. Every single one of these people in these different categories was subject to different regulations that covered everything: what you ate, what you wore, who you could speak to. And people moved around in the landscape in a highly controlled, dreamlike way, according to calendars which actually had different hours of the day, who could move in which direction. There were unlucky days and, lucky days, lucky colors, unlucky, and so on. So this is setting out this big ritual opportunity. And what happens is formal banquets were where all of this is played out. There's no military, so your form of competition and your form of display is in a banquet. And this is how they would work. There would be banquets probably every day. The banquets, as with Chris's, were male. I mean, there were private ones, but you almost never hear about them. And one of them, the only one, in fact, we know about is the cat banquet, the famous cat banquet. Let me see, it was, let's say, in the 10th century that cats were brought from China. Big import, very, very expensive, pets only for the elite. The emperor had cats and adored them. He was cat mad. When his favorite cat had kittens, he held a banquet, and he made all the kittens, he gave them the rank of court ladies or gentlemen, and he presented them with ceremonial rice cakes, which you would do for, a royal child. And there was lots of drunken revelry. This is a private party. And the only reason we hear about this is one of the members of the Fujiwara family was so appalled, and he thought it was sacrilegious, that he wrote it down, saying, "You've never seen what I saw at the palace." So that's how we know. But otherwise, that world is a closed door, and instead, what we have is the formal banquet. So it's all male. And they're very, very large. If you think of those great spaces, everything was opened up. You'd have the guest of honor flanked by, others of high rank, and then facing him, going back into the distance and off to the side, would be people of lesser rank. So you sat there, and you sat not at a table, but you sat some distance from anybody else. And just like, remember I told you that there were all these different ranks, and everybody had a particular place. It was so in these banquets, everybody had a place. There were officials who went around to make sure you sat down in the place to which you were entitled. Then you sat there, and you mustn't speak to anybody else. And you had to sit in a very, very controlled, physically controlled position, very rigid. So you don't speak, you don't move, you look ahead. Then the food is brought in. And the food is plated up outside, and it's brought in on individual tables. And what you're served and the kind of vessels that you have are different depending on your status. So, it was instantly obvious how you stood in the social ranking. And then the big thing is, the stuff was brought in usually from the rear. And you walk past all those who are of lower status so they could see exactly what the people at the top table were getting. And it was humiliating, except for those up at the top, for whom it was absolutely wonderful. So this comes, and then you sit there, and when you eat, you have to eat in a particular sequence. You know, you have first this kind of food, then this sort of food. You don't just have as you want. Then you have to hold your chopsticks in a particular way, and you have to move your arms in a particular way. It's almost like a dance sitting at your seat while remaining perfectly upright. And the thing is, all the officials and everybody else is going around to make sure you don't make a slip, because if you make a slip, you show that you're not one of us. And in this highly competitive society where you can't go out to war because there isn't any, this is the kind of warfare that goes on. So, and it goes on and on and on because these meals take hours. And every now and then they stop and they do like ceremonial presentation of gifts. And this is another thing. Do you get a gift or do you not? And is your gift better than somebody else's or not? And it's in the full sight of everybody. I mean, can you imagine? So at the end of all of this, you know, you're just absolutely rigid and also very stiff because you've been sitting down for so long. And there is not, I mean, you might have the odd little drink, but it's not part of it. So finally, the banquet is over. Hurrah! But no, it's not over. Because, oh yeah, I should also say that, you know, what happens is all the political agreements, all the negotiations tend to take place, let's say, off stage. And it's only during the banquet that you see who's been dealing with who the new alliances are with, who's in, who's out, right? So you have to sit there and watch all of that. Now, after the banquet, everything is cleared, and then, equally obligatory, is the after party. That's a drinking party. Everybody has to go, and everybody has to get drunk. So that now comes the sake, and you know, here we go. And the idea is here everything is relaxed. Instead of institutionalized order, you have institutionalized chaos. And people from different ranks, or you know, who are sitting on opposite sides of the hall, can talk to each other. You know, people who wouldn't normally speak can. And sorry, I got carried away. This is what this is one of the great regents. What?
Just a few minutes.
Oh yeah. Oh, right. And so this is what happened. You see the courtiers sort of, you know, rolling around, jumping on the court ladies. And the thing is, here you can do all the things that you aren't able to do in the formal situation. It would be completely dysfunctional if feasting was only like the rigid. So this is the antidote. And things can get done here. It's what anthropologists call sacred time, where the normal rules are relaxed and things can be done. And if it works out well, the consequences can go forward. But if you make a terrible faux pas, no one will remember. So it's a wonderful pressure valve. So this sequence of formal banqueting and, you know, drinking goes on after the Heian period through many, many different regimes, many changes of diet, many political changes, and still it remains today, because anyone who's done any business in Japan knows that any business meeting you may have and the dinner or lunch that may follow is just, you know, pleasantries, but it only really starts to happen when you go out to the drinking party, and then you get slightly smashed, and then you get down to business. So still it remains. And I think there was one. All right, so sake, it remains central. Oh yeah, this is the last thing, you know, like we talk about Japanese food and we Westerners say, oh, why does it look like that? It's really aesthetic, it's wonderful. You think about it, why do we accept this? What is it all about? What do you mean food is aesthetic? So anthropologists always look at food origin myths, which is, you know, how people think about how they got their first food. And usually origin myths are, you know, our God in his or her benevolence gave us this food because they loved us. But it wasn't like that in Japan. The food goddess, Ukemochi, she was entertaining another god. She wanted to make a banquet, and what she did is she vomited and excreted food from every orifice until she could fill 100 tables. And she said, here, look, how, you know. And he was so disgusted he killed her. But yet the food remained. But the thing is, you know, the Japanese are very, very, very ambivalent about food. They never, you don't, like in China, you get food writing from early times. You don't in Japan. Food does not appear. It isn't mentioned in the Monogatari. Very rarely, if ever, do you see them in ukiyo-e prints, except for like the drinking ones. You just don't see food. They don't like to eat in public. Still, a lot of Japanese women, you know, the ones, say, the middle-aged, they don't, when they go out in public, if they have to eat with strangers, they kind of eat behind the hand. It's not something they're comfortable with, and it stems from this sort of ambivalence. So that's another reason why drink has taken off. And when we go next door, there's a wonderful poem that I'm going to leave you with because it's 1,200 years old and it's often quoted today. And it is, "Oh, how ugly, people seeking wisdom and not drinking. Look on them. Well, don't they seem like monkeys?" In other words, if you want to be wise, drink. Thanks.
I have to apologize. I'm not going to talk that much about drink, actually. It'll come up a little bit at the end. So we're going to try to talk about tonight is something that some of you know that I like to talk about, which is differences in the sort of long term, the longue durée between Western Asia, Mediterranean, and you can include parts of India, the Indus Valley, a kind of Western Asian bread and baking and grinding and roasting world, and an East Asian, with a focus on China, world of boiling and steaming and sticky foods. And I really want to think about the kind of traditions and technologies of food preparation as something that precedes and underlies what we think of as civilizations in the traditional sense of complex societies or states, but that persists over the long term. And I see that some of the text has shifted here. Anyways, we'll start with a map. So here's a map of Eurasia, mostly Eurasia, showing kind of centers of early agriculture. And what the timeline at the bottom shows is how we know as archaeologists that the trajectories into agricultural societies were different in different places. So whether you have sedentism first or after you have cultivation, whether you have domestic animals first or after you have plant cultivation, when pottery is invented. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is if we step back from what is domesticated or not and think about the technologies, the traditions of food preparation, we get some rather stark contrasts. So some parts of the world, and this is true if you look at the Americas as well, have very early agriculture very early pottery that precedes agriculture. So a pre-Neolithic pottery, we might say. So hunter-gatherers who are using pots for cooking and preparing foods. And then we have other parts of the world that have aceramic agriculture. And so the Near East, Western Asia is the classic example of this, in which we have a domestication of plants and animals thousands of years before somebody makes the first crude bowl out of ceramics. And what that implies is that there's very different traditions of cooking and preparing food, and that then impacts the choices of foods, and both the species and then what people do with those species. And I think it then impacts how foods play a role in as social glue within societies and in relationships between the living and the supernatural. And that's something that Professor Rowland and I have published on a little bit, and we have, I think, more exploration to do in this area. So this lower map is a map from one of the articles we published on this a couple of years ago, which we sort of identified what we call the grinding niche over here, focused on Western Asia, where you have an aceramic Neolithic, and a boiling niche in East Asia, where you have ceramics that really predate agriculture by 8,000-9,000 years. So ceramics are highly developed by the time you get farming, and by the time you have things like rice and millets to put in those pots. And this kind of shows this contrast. So in Western Asia, we get a real development of the oven, or a sort of kit that includes ovens for baking, and these are things like tandoor ovens, so you've got a Peshwari naan on the wall of that oven being baked. The ovens, grinding tools for making flour, and then that also goes with roasting meat and the production of beer. And then in Eastern Asia, we have a real focus on boiling and steaming to create both kind of cohesive foods, but also grain-based alcohols, which are boiled and simmered. So we'll get on to drink things like sake a bit later on. Now, in very crude terms, we can think about whether you're grinding things and making flour and then making batter, making dough, or whether you're boiling things. They're both techniques for extracting calories from foods that are hard to eat or hard to digest on their own. So if you take a grain of rice or a grain of wheat and you try to crunch it up raw, you're not going to really be able to crunch it up. It's going to hurt your teeth and you're not going to be able to digest it. So if you want to make things like that edible, you have to do something to them, which is what cooking is. And what we have is in different traditions of cooking. The big question is why these different traditions have developed, when and where they did. And I'm not going to attempt to answer that question, but it's clear that those traditions are very long-lived. And on the one hand, you have grinding. What grinding does, of course, it breaks down. It separates the starch granules from the grain, so it breaks down. It increases the digestible surface area, and then, of course, it allows it to be mixed with water or other substances to make a dough, which can then be cooked and baked. So it increases the amount of calories that can be absorbed from grains. And boiling essentially does a very similar thing, but in a different way. It breaks down cell walls, it gelatinizes starches and makes them easier to digest, and it releases other nutrients that may also have a role in some foods in detoxifying. So in some sense, we can think of cooking, boiling it versus grinding as sort of alternative ways of intensifying the use of foods employed by hunter-gatherers. But what's interesting is that those styles persist and then determine how food traditions develop. And what I really wanted to do is kind of illustrate that really with archaeological and some modern examples and think through just how pervasive these different styles of food preparation are. So if we look at Western Asia, and I'll start with the Near East, the kind of bread world, and then we'll look at Eastern Asia. So if we look at the Near East, the oven and the grinding stone, the quern stone for making flour, are very pervasive. And I would say that those go with styles of cooking meat that include things like roasting. So your kebabs are here up on the top right. The earliest reported archaeological evidence from a site called Tel Merabit, which precedes domesticated crops, so it's right at the beginning of agriculture. This picture down here is at an early cultivation site before domestication, what's called pre-domestication cultivation of wheat and barley, Jurfa Lakmar, and all of the excavated houses, this is just one example, tend to have a room with emplacements of quern stones, so three or four grinding stones together. So there's a room for going and making your flour. It's a kind of central part of this household. It doesn't actually have reported ovens, so what they're doing with that flour is off-site or in the unexcavated area. So there are some interesting differences. Çatalhöyük, of course, is a famous Neolithic site. This is an oven from the later levels at Çatalhöyük, but the Çatalhöyük house, and many of them have now been excavated over some decades of archaeological research there. Every house has an oven, and it's a kind of central part of the main room is an oven. So every single house has an oven and has a storeroom, and you find grinding tools associated with the house. So it's a kind of household kit. And then over at the right is there's a site called Shani Chakmak in northeastern Iran, which was actually excavated by a Japanese team in the 1970s and is finally about to be published properly. But again, you have a nice example of these little rectangular houses, and each one, this sort of raised, there's a kind of raised room with a platform, and this raised feature here is an oven. So you have these square clay ovens, and each of the excavated houses at this site has a clay oven. Now, all of these sites are pre-ceramic. So although they're using clay to plaster their houses and to make ovens, and those ovens are obviously baking and becoming hardened, they're not actually using baked clay to make ceramic vessels for cooking. So the cooking is focused on the oven where you can bake bread and where you can roast meat and so forth. So it's a particular style of cooking. And that's, of course, true as we move into later periods in the Near East, and that the elaboration of cuisine, even after ceramics are developed, is focused on bread and baking. And so this is an image from Old Kingdom Egypt, a bakery scene where you have ceramic bread molds. So you've got the women up here grinding, and then men and then women down here baking bread. And here's an example of a bread mold. And so ceramics are then used not to boil, but to shape your breads and to make your different varieties of loaves for different ceremonial occasions, for different offerings in temples and so forth. And one of the, I suppose there's still a little bit of debate, but one of the sort of prevalent hypotheses for these early mass-produced things called double rim bowls, which are associated with early urbanism in Mesopotamia, is that those are bread molds as well. I would move forward into early scripts. So here are just a few examples. If you go through your sign lists of, Gardner's Ancient Egyptian Grammar has got big sign lists of hundreds of hieroglyphs at the back. A large percentage of them are different forms of bread loaves. So the whole alphabetic system or the phonetic system in ancient Egypt is based on this elaboration of bread.
Can I stop you? Just 1 second, I'll change the battery.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm talking between slides. I don't want to interrupt you mid-flow.
May I speak? Maybe not. Okay. Not yet.
It's telling me it's repairing the data, which is a bit worrying. Just wait 1 moment.
Okay.
We just carry on and just you chip in when you can. Yes.
Okay.
Carry on, Dominic.
Yeah. I mean, this one's still flashing. That's different.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Anyways, and then of course, and we obviously have to cut long story short here, but bread and baking runs right the way through Near Eastern cultures and Mediterranean cultures, and of course into Europe. So there is of course variation. In ancient Egypt, every house tended to have a quernstone where you have excavations of settlements, but not necessarily an oven. So it's not always the case that every house has an oven, and that's certainly true, I think, traditionally in Europe as well. So here we have a picture of a medieval baker's oven, something like this. And again, you wouldn't expect every household to have one of these, but every neighborhood or every village, so that the oven, the baker is central to that village, and of course bread is central to diet, but it's also central to symbolism in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the Islamic tradition, and so forth. So the daily bread becomes very important. And I have a picture there of a modern, idealized Western kitchen. I mean, this is from one of these home base or something websites where they're trying to tell you what your kitchen should look like. But of course, the thing to point out, and keep this in mind because we'll look at a Chinese kitchen later on, is that the oven is right there in the center. So the kitchen is a modern Western kitchen is supposed to have an oven, and I don't think many of us would expect otherwise. Now, of course, this oven tradition, we've been talking about the Western Asia, it also extends to the east. So you can track the spread of these early clay ovens east. And again, we have pre-ceramic farming in parts of western Pakistan. This is the site of Mehrgarh, where they're making buildings out of clay brick, and you have the remnants of ovens. And once you get into the Indus Valley proper, ovens are fairly prominent. So these are these tandoor ovens at early around the site called Kalibangan. And these are old photographs of things that are not certainly an oven. These are possibly ovens. But in any case, you have ovens at these Harappan sites are fairly prominent. Ovens and oven-like structures, some of which may be then get transferred to craft production. So if you look at early ceramic kilns or faience kilns, early copper smelting kilns, they're all based on the bread oven. So the bread oven provides the basis that then gets transferred to these other technologies. The earliest ceramics in the Indus region, also from Mehrgarh, start about 1,000 years after the site is founded, and they're very simple bowls, and they're also slab built. So they're built in the same way that you might build up a clay oven, or you might make a loaf of bread to stick on the oven. They're kind of slab built, and that's again a difference. That's kind of building on that same technique of creating ovens and breads in terms of practice, which is quite different from what you get in Eastern Asia in terms of early ceramic traditions. Now, of course, as you move into monsoon India, ovens become slightly less prominent, but the bread tradition continues, and you have various breads cooked over open fires, sometimes fried, sometimes even steamed. And I think that that's a fusion of some indigenous kind of Neolithic cooking traditions in India with the influence of the kind of Near Eastern Indus Valley elite culture. But one of the things to point out here is, of course, once you move into India, you get lots of other sources of flour. So various indigenous millets, indigenous legumes, and things like rice. So the primary way traditionally in which rice is used in South India, of course, if you go there today, you will get served rice. but a lot of the traditional breads and dishes are actually based on rice flour. So rice is turned into flour and then it's steamed or fried or baked over a fire. That's of course quite different from how we think of rice, as we'll see in a sort of East Asian context. Now, something that an argument that Mike and I developed in the papers we've written on this before is that when you then look at the religious traditions in these areas, the Near East or India, there's also a focus on what we might think of as kind of baking and roasting approaches to ritual and sacrifice, in which you have fire altars, in which things are roasted, so food offerings, meat and grains and so forth are roasted, incense is burnt, and the smoke that comes off of these ovens and roasting ritual, sorry about the typo there, I think roasting, it goes off and feeds the gods, so it kind of propitiates the gods through the fragrant smoke that's coming off the roasting and baking tradition. And we can see those in the roots of modern West Asian religions as well. Okay, now I'm going to switch. How are we doing on time?
Hurry up.
We had again. Okay, I'm going to switch very quickly then to Eastern Asia, where we have very different. So, as anyone who's an archaeologist will know, and we had a really interesting seminar here, partly on this yesterday on early ceramics. Ceramics in Eastern Asia, the kind of core area of Eastern Siberia, Central China, Japan, Korea, predates agriculture significantly and is really early. So pottery goes back to 18,000 years ago. It's well established over this very wide zone by about 10,000 BC. So very early. And even fairly early pots get quite elaborate. And by the time you get into the sort of Neolithic proper, so the period when we think people are cultivating and starting to domesticate things, you actually have quite elaborate typologies with tripod vessels for boiling, even stackable vessels for steaming things, stackable perforated vessels. Once you get into the sort of full-blown Neolithic, what's called the Yangshao tradition, the kind of diversity of cooking vessels is quite staggering, but it's also quite standardized. So all these things have standard Chinese names, and the reason they have standard Chinese names is all of these things get translated into bronze as soon as bronze working comes in, and they have their names written on them, and they have particular functions in terms of what kinds of things are cooked in them, what kinds of drinks are boiled and simmered in them, and what role they play. And so these things become very standardized in essentially the Yangshao and the Longshan Neolithic, and they remain so up into historical times. And this one, interestingly, is a sometimes mistranslated as an oven. It's a little stove in which you put coals and things in there, and then you simmer and cook on top. But it's not used as baking. It's not used for baking. It's a little controlled stove. Okay, so of course we know that they are cooking whatever they're cooking originally in the pots, whether it's fish, acorns, and so forth. Eventually they add crops to that repertoire, things like millet in the north and rice in the south. The nature of boiling and steaming these things, of course, will make these cereals somewhat sticky. So stickiness in cereals is partly about cooking. It's also partly about genetics. And what's clear is that there is selection over time for genetic change in the crops of Eastern Asia to make them stickier and stickier. Which kind of implies that the cooking tradition is first, it develops a set of tastes, and then those get kind of exaggerated through time through genetic change. Sorry, that skipped forward a bunch ahead. So this again is to contrast the Beijing kitchen. So this is a new build faculty housing from Peking University in Beijing, so presumably roughly middle class, made available to faculty in 2013. And there's the cooker, so newly decorated last year, very modern hob, no oven. Right, that's just storage underneath. No oven.
Microwave, no?
A microwave, yes, sure. Yes. Microwave, sure. That's a 20th. They'll have a microwave, of course. But it's about the cooker. It's about the woks and things for steaming on top. No oven. And I've been in a lot of Chinese family homes and things. People don't have ovens. What would you do with an oven? There's no tradition of baking potatoes or baking bread or having pot roast. It's not part of the cooking tradition. So an oven is not really functional there. But the frying and boiling and steaming traditions are, of course, very important. This is another example of these early ceramic stoves in which you put some coal in there and then you can keep your certain dishes warm and so forth. And archaeologically, where we have settlements, sorry, that's not a very good slide. It's one of my own, not very good pictures. One of my own. This is a Yangshao house, typical Yangshao house, which is which is square, and there's a sort of dugout area in there, which is where the hearth was. It's been excavated out, but there's no oven. It's just simply a cooking fire. Right? So the pots go over that fire on their little tripod stands for boiling and simmering. So there's large settlements have been excavated, no ovens in China, whereas you excavate a little bit of a site in northeastern Iran or Turkey in the Neolithic, and ovens are everywhere. So there's a significant difference in the styles. And of course, when wheat comes to China, and it comes to China about 4,000 years ago, but it really takes off as an important crop only from the Han Dynasty. And one of the reasons it takes off so late as an important crop is actually because they don't really know what to do with wheat. So it's clear from early record that they're boiling it whole as you would do rice, and wheat maybe is not quite as pleasant. And so it's initially associated in the sort of as food for the poor. In the Han period, they get rotary querns, which are coming from the Mediterranean world. And then you have nice wheat flours, and so of course it becomes noodles, it becomes baozas, dumplings, things that can be steamed and boiled. So the wheat then gets adjusted to the cooking tradition and elaborated upon. So lots of elaborate forms of dumplings and so forth. So what is the role of this in society? Well, one of the things that is different is the ritual traditions. So feasting is very important, and these kind of standardized feasting kits. This is from a particular burial at a particular site where you get these kind of standardized kits. These are interpreted as, and we know this from later written sources and Bronze Age vessels and so forth, as a series of food vessels, food and wine vessels. And wine in this context is being made out of things like sticky millet or sticky rice, in which the family is supposed to feast with the ancestor, and the ancestors who are buried are supposed to be sort of joining in the feast. And this has been characterized by Sarah Nelson, an archaeologist who's worked in Korea and northeast China, as feasting to create ancestors. So the whole tradition going back to the Yangshao is these feasts at the gravesite which create the ancestors and maintain that lineage. So it shares, so it keeps the ancestors close. So it's quite different from having smoke on a roasting pit that propitiates distant gods. You have the ancestors sort of sharing in the substance. And as I mentioned before, as bronze comes in, the early use of bronze in China is very much focused on making vessels for feasting and drinking for the elite burial rituals. These are just some examples here. And of course, this is what they're drinking from what we know is stuff, as I say, based on grain, so rice and millets, especially the sticky varieties, which are also better for fermenting into alcohol. And of course, that's the basis of moving forward in times of things like your shoju, your baijos in China, and your sakis and so forth. So there's a long tradition of that. And again, the role of feasting for ancestors is again still very important in many East Asian and Southeast Asian societies. So I think there's a wider set of commonalities here which differentiate them from the sacrificial roasting of Western Asia and the bread world. And there's lots of then products that are made out of things like sticky rice. You have 2 more minutes? My sticky rice thing? Which again become very important ritual food. So when you look at the role of sticky millet or sticky rice, not just in China but adjacent regions, including Japan, which you've been hearing about before, there's lots of products that are made from these things, which to some Western palates might be considered an acquired taste. I certainly found that myself in being presented with a bowl of these for breakfast on Chinese New Year. They're little sticky rice balls which are very difficult to chew, and they usually have a sticky bean paste in them. Anyways, but you're supposed to eat them on Chinese New Year. And the way you do these, of course, there is processing. There's a pounding of the sticky cereals to make them into a paste so that they can be then steamed or boiled or so forth and presented and made into sweets. What's interesting from a botanical or sort of plant evolution point of view is in Eastern Asia there's a whole bunch of things that have become sticky in terms of having genetic changes that make the starch mostly amylopectin, which makes them sticky, very sticky. And these things include species which are native there, like the first 3, which are native to China, and things that have come into China from other places. Interestingly, things like barley and sorghum. Well, sorghum is African. You don't find sticky varieties in Africa. It gets to India, you don't find sticky varieties in India. You find sticky varieties in northeast China, Korea, Japan. And even maize, which has only been there a few hundred years, now has at least 2 different mutant types that make it sticky. and we understand the genetics of these things, and things haven't spread the other way. So there's an interesting sense in which the cultural tradition of cooking and taste and the importance of these sticky foods in certain festival and ritual events is determining the genetic adaptations of crops in that area. So there's a feedback from culture. This is just a map showing this distribution in broomcorn millet, so-called common millet in Europe. You can go buy it at Planet Organic. It's your health food millet grown in Europe. Sticky varieties are only found in China, Korea, Japan, including Taiwan. And the sticky varieties never spread out of China, even though this species does spread. So there's a selective cultural frontier between the world of sticky cereals and non-sticky cereals. And I think it relates to this frontier between the baking bread world, which has use of roasting as a ritual, as part of the ritual system, and an Eastern world in which keeping the family and the ancestors close through the sharing of grain-based wines and sticky foods is central. And so I think we should stop there because I've done too much. And you can look at the ways in which people represent, their ancestors represent pregnancy and birth. Does she have a bun in the oven, or is she a vessel who's boiling sperm, essentially, which is what a Han text manual will tell you is what happens. These, again, infiltrate sort of the way people think about their bodies and their family.
Dory, thank you very much. Could I ask about idealization? This word came out several times. I mean, but this sense of, in many ways, is about separation and differentiation and being able to keep things apart. But you can only do that by making a play upon how feasting and drinking promotes ideas about an ideal world. And therefore, in a sense, being civilized and the notion of civilization gets linked to idealization of, maybe, both ethical and moral behavior, but also just being of pleasure, and the ideal way to live. Is that something that one can see as a kind of theme, or through the different talks?
Well, of course, there is the famous theory of my erstwhile mentor Norbert Elias on the civilizing process. The idea that the process of civilization is one which involves progressive controls and regulations, so that you both from outside in the form of the formation of the modern state, and from inside in the sense of the internalization of a kind of superego, which then regulates conduct and sharpens particular aesthetics of taste. And he gives, of course, many examples from the development of courtly cultures in Europe in relation to that. But I'm sure there are lots of other. I actually wanted to ask a question about stickiness.
Okay.
How much is it to do with chopsticks?
I don't think it is, because if you look in Southeast Asia, where sticky cereals are also popular, chopsticks are not.
Right.
I think chopsticks are probably, if anything, chopsticks are an adaptation to stickiness rather than the other way around. So once you have sticky rice, it makes more sense to develop chopsticks.
Right. But then, I mean, I don't see logic of why, if you are feasting the ancestors, why the rice has to be sticky. It could be the rice of India, for instance. You could still give that to the ancestors, couldn't you?
I mean, theoretically you could, but it doesn't tend to be done.
Yeah.
So I think
I think
it's a kind of, you're cooking in a way which makes things more cohesive. The stickiness then comes after that, and then it gets more associated with that.
What often happens is this being able to bring your particular pad of rice or sticky rice, and rather like we get the same thing in West Africa, where you've got the same kind of boiling tradition and ancestors. different families will bring theirs together. You then mix it together, or pound it together. Then you share it out again as this act of commensality. So it's a pulling together, or putting things together, and then sharing it out. And stickiness is essential for doing that. Rather like with taro and yam and those kind of pace in African food as well, actually. And the interesting, they both had ancestors.
And that there is a contrast with rice in India, where rice, your basmati rice and things, which are very light, very dry, and they're meant to absorb sauces. But you also don't share them, because within the sort of caste framework, if you share with somebody, they could be polluting you. They could be the wrong caste. So you don't want other people to touch your food, and you don't share. You don't eat out of a communal. In China, at least, you have in other parts of Southeast Asia, you have the tradition of sharing out from a communal dish onto your dish, which won't happen in a. So those things are also reinforcing some of these differences.
You mentioned that the rise of Mehon was it had to do with the differentiation and classes and so forth. And I was wondering how much of the religious difference, how much religion played a role in the rise of Mehon, because the theoretical assumption, at least from the sort of Greek academics, is that it's the Yenicheris who were taken, the young boys taken from Ottoman army to the court, to the Ottoman army. They sort of drank in Mehon most of the time, and sort of constructed this institution as a secluded kind of place where they would be and kind of exercise their religious sort of life and pleasure, conviviality. Is there any evidence to suggest that, or is it just sort of?
Oh yeah, there's lots and lots of work on taverns of different kinds, and certainly the Janissaries were great drinkers, and they had their own taverns with dancing boys, talking about the Greek homoerotism, and but that was only one kind of tavern, because on the other hand, in Istanbul, for instance, you had all the Christian parts and the Jewish parts of, which had lots of mehanas, which were quite different, and people from the upper class, Muslims from the upper classes, drank in these, although they were discreet. The example of one 17th century Qadi of Galata, a religious judge of Galata, was a famous drinker and a poet, and one of his lines was, how can you make me a judge of Galata and ask me not to drink? So in fact there were all kinds of different kinds of mehana, of taverns, and one of the most interesting was the bozahana. Now boza is made from grain. It's a kind of beer which made of stale bread sometimes, or from millet, and it's not supposed to be alcoholic, but it is. So in fact there was a play in the bozahana. You had sweet boza, which was freshly made and not alcoholic, but then you had sour boza, which was alcoholic. But the pretense of the tavern keepers was that it was non-alcoholic. But then every now and again you'd have drunken riots in the bozahana, and then there'd be a problem about. So in fact they were. Don't get me talking about it. There is an enormous range of different kinds of drinking locations and drinking cultures.
There's this. I know from a very West African thing where you don't allow women to drink after the raffia wine is fermented for more than 3 days, because they become uncontrollable. So the idea of what I suppose two things. One is maybe to also Maria, for Christopher's talk, this separation of the drink from the eating, and the idea that you move from the Apollonian to the Dionysian, or to the out of control, and how being out of control is part of the structuring of things, and then how do you actually prevent things just getting out of control. I mean, you know, the structure collapses, and are there subversive acts, and can women, you know, sort of get beyond the 3 days and they actually get in there, or is there ways of undermining that?
Well, I guess I suppose what I know best is actually a rather different kind of context for the eating and the drinking, which is in the Roman world, and it struck me as being one of the things that I found very intriguing here is trying to see whether there are any ways of intersecting the issues around what types of food there are and what types of cooking there are and what kinds of mechanisms you have for cooking, and how you then get to these really complicated social ritualistic structures which might have order or disorder in them, but are ways of playing out in a sort of microcosmic way aspects of the social order. So in the Roman world we have all these endless anecdotes about the kinds of banquets that Roman emperors had, in which endlessly they are arranging things or doing things that subvert the social order, or displaying their incredible power in the way in which they can control the events of the day. But I was sort of standing back from that thinking, listening to the talks this evening, about how one sees, if one sees at all, any relationship between those sorts of very complex social rituals and the actual processes of food making, and whether we think that there is some kind of chain there, or is it quite arbitrary how the social structures work in comparison to the food production. I don't know what any of you think about that.
Well, you don't always get descriptions of food making. In Japan, it isn't until, let's say, 200 years after the Heian period that you start to get what you might call cookery manuals. But they're more about, in the case of Japan, technique and appearance, how to cut the food and how to arrange it. But not cookery as you would know it from your sorts of text. Also, a lot of things were not put on paper right the way through because they were regarded as guild secrets or the equivalent. It was very difficult to say what the cookery was like, except in Japan. It was, I think, what you would call a water culture. You know, you steam and you boil, which are clean, or else you grill, but you never fry because there's no fat in the diet. So, you know, you can see from an anthropological point of view how it's almost kind of a transformation, you know, very Levi-Straussy, from the cook to the raw through transforming, purifying process. But how they're actually, you know, in the kitchen cranking it out remains dark until really quite late.
But frying, you have tempura.
Ah, that's later. That's after Western. Yeah, Western, and there's some from the Dutch as well.
Yeah. So you're talking really about much earlier times.
Much earlier.
And then, at what stage do you get the kind of raw fish culture?
Fish they always had.
But raw fish.
I think they always had it. If you look at the earliest manuals you can get, it's about slicing certain sorts of raw fish. It's just they didn't arrange it in quite the sushi way we do. That was later. That was like a meze that took off.
But I mean, to have fresh fish, you need the transport. You know, I think fresh fish spread in Europe with the railways. Otherwise, they always had salted fish.
Well, they had a huge amount of salted fish.
Yeah. So presumably then, raw fish that wasn't salted must have been confined to the
coast and elite, and you had the highways. You know, if you had it going to the court, they would be like non-stop, full tilt and change horses. You know, that sort of thing.
Right.
But no, it was a great delicacy, the raw.
Yeah.
Yes, would you exclude Xinjiang in China?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, Xinjiang is very much in the Central Asian bread world.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's also very much the frontier. So there's an interesting site recently worked on called Subeishi in Xinjiang, which is kind of 500 BC, something like that, which has both remains of bread and noodles, and the noodles are made out of millet. So it's right. It's just at the frontier, but it's very much the Central Asian bread world. And if you look at, you know, where bread kind of traditional breads come into China, they'll be attributed to Xinjiang and Islamic influences. So if you go to Xi'an and you go to an Islamic restaurant, they will make bread, which is this imported tradition.
And the other thing I was thinking of when you were speaking, you know those awful dough things people eat. I can't remember the sort of pump. But anyhow, xiaobin, that's cooked in a barrel, a tin barrel, and it's sort of flat, and then they bang it on the side. But the heat is coming from a fire underneath, and then it's turned over. And I lived in Xi'an. I lived on xiaobin. That's what I had for breakfast every morning, and bananas.
Yeah, so I think that's
the nearest thing I wondered.
Yes, and that tradition I think is coming from Xinjiang in Central Asia. And what's happened is the metal. I've also seen metal sort of upturned woks to make kind of metal ovens.
Correct.
That's a kind of, once metal is cheap and readily available, replacing the clay oven and making it more portable.
That's how you make chapatis and side bread in Turkey or Iran.
Yeah.
And the flour used for the xiaobin, would that have been rice flour? I never thought of that.
No, it's wheat flour.
It would be wheat.
It is wheat flour. I mean, what's interesting is wheat gets to China quite early, but it mostly gets turned into noodles and things that you can steam and boil.
It's fascinating. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There's just one last point. The point about boundaries here is what's most striking is how porous they are. You know, that the whole thing is about allowing, sort of things across them, and yet maintaining them by being able to adapt them to something on the other side of a boundary. Yeah. So the things flow and people may flow, but it's something about the way in which something inside means that whatever flows across that boundary then has to be adapted to whatever is very durable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that things do flow across the boundaries and they're porous, but they're also selective. So not every type of wheat makes it to China. It's only bread wheat. Whereas in Central Asia and India, you've got emmer wheat and things which have much less gluten protein, so they don't lend themselves to sticky noodles in the same way. Perhaps.
So they're rejected.
And the sticky rice gets as far west as Assam. You have traditional sticky rice varieties, but it doesn't get into India. But there's certainly contact and lots of flow between Southeast Asia and India, but the sticky rices don't flow west. So there's a selection against as well. That's in some sense maintaining some sort of tradition of taste. And
maybe we should get to the tradition of drinking the wine.
I think so. It's an endurance, isn't it, to talk about food and drinks very, very late in the evening. So thank you all very much for coming, and there are some refreshments waiting for us in the room next door. Thank you.